Hello, welcome to a special edition of At the Wheel with me, Joe White of the High Speed Rodeo newsletter, which you can find on Substack, Tu Lee of Sino Auto Insights, who also writes on Substack, and our special guest, David Kennedy, who is the Toronto Bureau Chief for Automotive News. And we are going to be diving into the meaning and the background and all the ins and outs of the Canadian trade deal with China that is going to open the door, at least partway, to Chinese electric vehicles coming into the North American Free Trade Zone by way of Canada. David, welcome. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Welcome, David.
David, why don't we just let you set the table here? Talk about this deal that Prime Minister Mark Carney and Xi Jinping and their respective trade negotiators have put together. I know that it involves more than electric vehicles, but you'll bring us to that, and then we're going to talk about the potential impact on the auto market. But sort of sketch this out and what's the background here?
Let me do this, David. Give yourself 30 seconds, introduce yourself, your background, how long you've been a journalist, things like that for our audience.
Yeah, sure. So I've been at Automotive News 4.5 years or so. We've been covering up here in Canada, covering the automotive market. I've kind of kicked around journalism for a while, always writing on the business side of things. So I cover manufacturing before, infrastructure, construction, all that kind of stuff, along with, finance and all the other areas you end up writing about. But yeah, automotive has been the focus for the past 4 or 5 years. And it's an interesting time to be writing about automotive, that's for sure.
It always is.
Too much of everyone, I wouldn't think. But yeah, getting back to China, to set the table here, Canada's had a strained relationship with China for quite some time. It goes back farther than this, but it really hinges on back in 2018, the Meng Wanzhou issue that, Canada ended up detaining the CFO of Huawei, and really tensions ratcheted up from there, stayed there, diffused a little bit when everybody went home, but never really got back to where they were. So this really signals a pretty big change with China. And obviously, what we saw back in 2014 when the US imposed tariffs on Chinese EVs, Canada did the same. Basically that was done in lockstep. It was done within a few weeks of one another. And, Canada's tariffs were the same. It was, we have up here in Canada, it's the most favored nations rate is 6.1% tariff. And we slapped an extra 100% on that on Chinese EV imports into Canada. So it became 106.1%. That obviously, as we've been talking about, as of last week, gets lowered back to 6.1% on just 49,000 coming in from China annually. And kind of in exchange for that, Canada has taken some pressure off of its agricultural industries. In retaliation for the EV tariffs back in 2024, China had slapped tariffs on canola and a few other products that are, big drivers of the Canadian economy out west.
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that we all know is that China has a way of leveraging wedge issues, particularly within Canada. It's a big country. There's different interests across the country, and agriculture is big out west. Manufacturing is big in Ontario, and there's some, others around. But this was a very big wedge issue for Canadians. So that's why I think the Carney government decided that, it needed some resolution here to try to normalize relations.
The context. There's more. So that's great. And I'd forgotten about the Huawei executive's arrest. And you're absolutely right. It's a big deal. Was a big deal. There's more context here that I want you to kind of explore specifically around cars, because Carney did this after a full year of Donald Trump, saying, actually, including a week or so ago, saying we don't need Canadian cars, pressuring U.S. companies to pull operations out of Canada. I think some Canadian auto plants have actually lost product, right, or lost their. So talk about that context, because it seems like it was just very intentional on the part of the Carney government to make this deal around cars.
Yeah, let me hammer this home, because I believe there wasn't a Canadian Prime Minister who had traveled to China since 2017, correct?
Yeah.
So,
strained,
to hammer that home.
Yeah. And about the American context, of course, we all know very well what's been going on over the last year with auto tariffs in North America and the sort of worsening relationship between Canada and the US when it comes to trade. And yeah, Joe, you're right. So there are a few Canadian plants that have taken hits off of this. The most notable example is Stellantis' plant in Brampton.
Right.
They were teed up to build the next Jeep Compass, and that product, they were retooling. They had started the project. They pressed pause on that back in February of 2025, before tariffs even started, but because of tariffs. And then I can't remember exactly when it was, but a few months back, it was, basically announced that that product was never going to come to Brampton. That plant has never got another product. So its future is basically up in the air. Stellantis has made some promises about what will happen, nothing definitive. They say it's not closing, but it hasn't come back. And then the other big notable change that we've seen so far is GM's going to pull a shift from the Oshawa assembly plant just east of Toronto at the end of the month, unless something changes. There was one change previously, so we could see another. But yeah, I mean, that's the issue here. And I think that's part of the reason we've seen Carney look to China. It's because, as the Prime Minister himself said, the US is no longer a reliable partner to Canada. The thing about the USMCA is that, as we all know in auto, parts are still moving across the border, but vehicles are tariffed. And I think it's lost somewhere along the lines of communication that it's a flagrant violation of NAFTA or USMCA that vehicles are being tariffed, particularly in the context of Canada.
Yeah.
There's a side letter to the USMCA that says Canada can bring in 2.6 million vehicles tariff-free, regardless of Section 232 tariffs, which is exactly the lever that Trump leaned on to apply these tariffs to Canada. It's like the violation could not be more black and white. So up here in Canada, I think there's a recognition that, things need to change.
There's one other thing.
Let me put some context into this.
Yeah, why don't you jump in?
In 2024, we don't have complete 2025 data yet, so I'm going to use 2024. And David, you check me on this. About 1.85 million units sold in Canada, about 300,000 units from GM, 275 from Ford. Stellantis is a little bit further down. GM had almost 16% share. F-150 is a big seller, 100 and something thousand units in Canada. So the importance of the Canadian market to the U.S. automakers cannot be lost here. And so when they said that they were going to be moving production or not reinvesting or whatever, right? Effectively closing plants, taking capacity out, moving it to the United States. Symbolically, if I was Canadian, I would be less apt to buy an American car now, okay? And it creates, 49,000 is not a lot. It's about 1%, less than 1%, but very, very symbolic, and it does create this very different, let's say, almost different view of what used to happen between the U.S. and Canada with regards to trade. And so, was this something that Carney brought on himself, or was this something that was likely going to happen if Trudeau was still, around? Like, what was the straw that kind of broke the camel's back, do you think?
It's difficult to say whether or not it would have happened under Trudeau. I think so much has happened in the past year that it's impossible to really gauge where we would have been now. I think the relationship between Canada and the US would have been worse if Trudeau was still in place. It was very clear that Trump and Trudeau did not see eye to eye on pretty much anything. So I think it's probably good that we had a change of pace there and leadership. But I think there was a lot coming up to this. And it wasn't one thing, but it is that continual strain that the auto tariffs it's just so flagrant a violation. Steel and aluminum tariffs are a violation, and it's just there's this. It just continual, and it's a lack of recognition that you are breaking the rules. And I think it's just one of those things that eventually something's got to give. And I do think probably getting a little ahead of the conversation here, but it maybe signals a little bit about what Carney thinks might happen with USMCA negotiations as well.
Well, yeah, and he, again, we were talking about how he's a sophisticated guy. You don't actually have to be that sophisticated to hear Donald Trump say Canada's irrelevant to me, the USMCA, which, by the way, let's not forget, he and his people negotiated that in his first term. That is his deal. He signed it. He
no
made a
one
big
mentions
deal.
that. No one
No,
mentions that.
I like to remind people that he is repudiating a deal that he himself oversaw, signed off on.
It was a beautiful deal. 5 years ago. Beautiful deal. It was a beautiful deal.
Best deal he ever signed, ever
best
created.
Deal, whatever. Okay.
Oh, believe me, we remember that up here.
No, I'll bet. David, let me ask you this. So, and there's a lot to unpack here for sure. But when I was scanning the headlines about this, when I was writing my latest newsletter, went out Tuesday morning. One of the things I came across, and I don't remember who this was. I'm not sure it was Carney. I think it was maybe another government minister or MP. I'm not sure. But somebody was saying, look, what we really want is for Chinese companies to invest in Canada, build in Canada, bring Chinese technology to Canada. So first of all, is that what you were hearing? And once we kind of, the Chinese technology in Canada is where I want you to jump in on that, because that's where that could be a real flashpoint. Well, let's get the facts straight first, David. What are the facts?
Yeah. So that's transparently true. I mean, it's in the official government line essentially on this, that the intention is to bring Chinese technology, automotive technology, to Canada with quote trusted partners. So who that trusted partner is open to interpretation, but whether or not that's
Magna, perhaps.
It certainly could be. I mean, it could be an American automaker with a plant that has capacity in Brampton at the moment. You don't know, right? There are lots
That's true. Stellantis has a JV with Leap Motor, electric vehicle company.
And they build in Europe already. So, there's questions like that it's speculation at this point what's actually being discussed. But unequivocally, the Canadian government is looking to bring Chinese manufactured automotive products to Canada.
And technology.
Now, David, are there a lot of brownfields where they could quickly be converted, or would it be, a longer term 3, 5, 7 year kind of thing before you actually saw a Chinese vehicle through a JV being built in Canada?
Well, there's a couple opportunities. Brampton is the most glaring one at the moment, but there is another plant, GM's Cami plant, which is, a relatively modern facility, or I should say a very modern facility. It was just retooled to build the bright drop vans, which went by the wayside at the end of last year, just wasn't selling. So as much as I didn't mention that earlier, simply because the product wasn't selling, it's hard to say that GM pulled that product from Canada for tariff reasons. It was probably more of a market play decision. But at the same time, that plant is currently
a serendipitous kind of
you could say that. But it's hard to criticize them too heavily on the fact that they were, selling a couple thousand vans a month. It's hard to make a viable plan.
But I would say, and I'm channeling some people that I heard talking about this at the Detroit Auto Show, including Michael Robinette of S&P, and that is that, if the USMCA was not up in the air, I mean, in other words, if the trade relationship between the U.S. and Canada was stable, quite possibly GM and Stellantis would have said, okay, fine, we're going to move this product back to the United States, or we're going to kill this product in the case of GM. We've got an investment plan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're not hearing that, right? And I think partly that's because they don't know what the rules are going to be. They don't know what the economics are going to be. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just the optics of it. It makes, especially the Detroit automakers at the moment are duck and cover a little bit, I guess I would say, when it comes to Trump. You don't want to put a target on your back, and investing any amount of money into Canada at the moment doesn't necessarily look good.
Now, let me ask you, if I'm a Chinese automaker and I have capacity in Europe that I've just stood up, could I ship it to Canada, and would that count as against the 49,000, or would that be under kind of a totally different policy?
It should apply to a different policy, at least to my understanding now. We can get to homologation and all those other issues because that would become part of a problem if you're shipping vehicle specs for Europe to Canada. Yeah, it's basically the way it's worded, and the details are still to be ironed out. We haven't seen any official documents on this kind of stuff yet. It's still early days, but all of basically everything indicates that 49,000 vehicles coming directly from China, not Chinese automakers, like from China itself.
So I want you to I really want you to take the lead on this, but the thing about technology, talk about that, because you mentioned it earlier that in the United States, this appears to be a really bipartisan. I don't know if it's a consensus, but certainly you hear both parties, people from both parties saying we don't want Chinese technology, in the United States. Talk about that, and then I'm interested to hear the two of you talk about that. Because here's Canada, which at least nominally still has a trade agreement with the United States that nominally offers open access. What do you think the over-under on all that is? I mean, bringing the Chinese smart vehicle technologies to North America through this channel.
So the Biden administration on its way out had put in two policies, a framework for connected hardware and software associated with Chinese companies and restrict them from being a part of any vehicles in the U.S. that are on U.S. public roads. Okay, so I'm trying to be very careful and deliberate with how I explain it. So that did not preclude Chinese cars, if they were compliant, imported into the United States, but the 100% tariff kind of eliminates that. Okay, so it's very clear now, getting down to the 5,000 foot level. If I'm reading this as a risk management person at an OEM, I'm looking at it like my bill of materials. It can't be layer one at the tier one layer. It has to be tier 3, tier 4, tier 5, making sure that none of the firmware is even Chinese, because that creates risk for my bill of materials and my supply chain. So is Canada looking at also, does it have an existing, let's say, position on, because let me take a step back. What are the China hawks in Canada saying about Chinese vehicles, connected vehicles, and what type of risk, and or if there are any policies currently, or do you foresee somebody really, really highlighting that as new area of where they need to really look in Canada?
Yeah, well, unquestionably, it's come up. And you mentioned the Biden administration putting in those rules. At the exact same time, Canada there was no formal rules so far as I remember, but there was sort of a commitment to build a framework similar to what the US had put in place. And, that back 4 years ago, that wasn't unusual to see Canada move in lockstep with the US on those kind of regulations. That's why this is such a departure from what we've seen. But at the same time, fast forward to today, there's absolutely concern about privacy, about cybersecurity, about all of those issues. That's cropped up over the last week as we've been sort of digesting this China deal. The Carney government clearly seems relatively unconcerned about it. There's been no official position on exactly, where the data is going to be hosted and all those sort of details yet, because it's just too early days, I think, for that. But at the same time, the China hawks in the country, that would certainly is one of the talking points that they're latching on to, raising concerns about those issues, and kind of how we're going to navigate it remains to be seen.
So how quickly?
To me,
well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. So this is the perfect time to be discussing this. It's a significant market, 1.85 million units. So China would love to enter this market. So in doing so, Canada now has some leverage before this 49,000 unit quota becomes real and on Canadian roads. And to me, with U.S. politicians, if there's valid concerns in the policies that the Biden administration put in place aren't significant enough, then let's articulate what needs to be done in the current politicians and administration, right? Like, to me, if you're just arguing there are national security concerns, let's articulate what those are, and let's address them in a policy, because otherwise it's like a straw man argument. I'm just scared. I'm scared. I don't know what to do about it, but I'm scared. So in Canada, with the rubber meeting the road within the next probably 8 to 10 months, that probably needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. So I'm looking forward to seeing how the Carney administration addresses this.
Yeah, well, and the U.S. is going to have to address it too. I agree with you that Canada is going to have to do it. It's unclear right now anyway what kind of vehicles we're going to be getting. Prior to any of these tariffs, it was Tesla that was shipping Chinese vehicles into Canada.
Yeah, that was a point I was going to make. It seems like the Chinese automaker most ready to jump on this opportunity is Tesla.
Yeah. Yeah,
And,
it is. It
yeah,
unquestionably would be.
Volvo.
They have switched. They have
or Volvo.
switched their sourcing, so they're bringing in the Model Y from Germany to Canada to avoid U.S. Canadian counter tariffs on U.S. built vehicles. So they're monkeying with that. We could see the Model 3 come back from China, but yeah, Volvo, Polestar were each bringing relatively small quantities in. So there's still questions to be answered on who's going to get these quotas, who's going to assign the quotas. You assume it's China, but it's unclear, at least from our vantage point. And yeah, we'll kind of see. But the thing is, as much as Canada needs to decide on its own policy, the US is going to need to decide on some sort of security policy as well. Are we going to see Chinese vehicles legal on the road in Canada that get stopped at the border? Is it going to be another thing for a border guard to check if you've got a BYD, if you've got a Cherry, like you can't enter the country? Is that going to become a thing? Because, the thousands of vehicles that enter the US from Canada every day, it's going to become pretty tough to police pretty quickly.
Many of them through Michigan.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And probably a lot of them driven by automotive executives and managers who buy these things, for whatever reason. Right. Right. But I mean, and I guess it sounds like the answer to the question, have any of the purely Chinese manufacturers, BYD, Xiaomi, any of those brands, have they said, oh yeah, this is great, we're going to start shipping tomorrow? I mean, I'm not aware that they have, but has that happened yet?
We haven't seen anyone come out publicly like that, with the exception of Lotus, which is Geely associated with Volvo and Polestar. Lotus seemed to be eager to get a piece of the action. They're the one that has come out publicly and said it. But one thing to note about BYD in particular is that back in 2024, just before the tariffs were imposed by Ottawa, we knew BYD had begun looking at the Canadian market. They had started conversations with the federal government, and we talked to dealers at the time who were having conversations with BYD about setting up distribution networks in Canada. And as far as I know, those talks were advanced enough to, it would have happened relatively imminently. I don't know exactly the stage they got, if there was any pen to paper at that point, but I know we were close. And the reality is that BYD probably has some of the footwork or groundwork laid already. Open question on homologation and other issues, but it would not be a surprise if BYD weren't too far behind.
Yeah.
If I may, gentlemen, I might categorize it this way, because the moment Carney said this on Friday, the Tesla stands flooded social media. This is a huge win for Tesla, huge win. First of all, it's 49,000 units. Tesla's shrinking sales at 49,000 units might help for a month, and it's not going to really help them, from an overall sales standpoint. But they do have the network there. And then if we look at the first tier of companies, and David, to your point, in Shanghai last year, I met 2 different Canadian automotive dealership groups walking around kicking the tires on Chinese cars. So the dealership groups are very, very open. It's really important to remember that the legacy automakers, they're not growing in any significant way in any major market. And so these dealership groups see an opportunity for growing and building upon the Chinese brands in Canada. And this accelerates that, obviously. But the first level is going to be Tesla, obviously, who already has existing facilities in Canada, the Volvos of the world, the Polestars, as you had mentioned, Polestar. So let's use Geely as the umbrella for all those brands. Okay, so Tesla, Geely, BYD, because they're moved so fast and they're in 100 countries already. So inking deals in Canada would probably be pretty easy for BYD, and they have some big boats.
Yeah, they have a lot of boats.
China.
Oh, and the other thing that I thought,
1,000 units at a time. So
yeah, the other thing, yeah, they could fill that quota pretty quickly. I mean, there's a couple things, David, that I want to run by you too. I mean, and you talked about dealers, and that's really important. So it seems like, I mean, again, so let's put aside Tesla, which doesn't really have dealers per se, and Volvo, which has been in the market forever. But it seems like if you're a BYD, and you don't have a North American distribution network, and you don't fully know from actual experience what it's like to run a North American distribution network and have relationships with North American dealers, this is great. This is like you're suddenly allowed to play AAA ball. No offense, but in a volume sense in Canada, right? You're not having to sell 5 million all at once. You're selling Canadian levels, but you're playing in a space that's essentially culturally and probably in terms of commercial relationships, essentially a proxy for the United States. This is great for them, right? It's a learning ground.
Yeah, unquestionably. It would be a great spot to set up and see how things go, see what works, see what doesn't, see how quickly volumes could grow, where the market would absorb things, if it's rural or urban. Yeah, I mean, unquestionably, if you're a Chinese automaker, I can't imagine you would not be interested, at least in shipping vehicles over here.
Yeah.
So can we look at the demand side now? The Canadian consumer, I'm going to pull out a broad brush, so you help me kind of discern the pro to the con, and then also looking at it from the standpoint of MSRP, right? In the United States, MSRP is going the wrong way. It's $50,000. US to take a quote from my friend Joe, it's becoming a rich person's product. So what do the Canadian consumers think of a Chinese vehicle generally? Is it a reasonably positive in certain places, provinces, they're not very friendly to Chinese cars? Or can you talk a little bit about how you think the reception is going to be for these Chinese brands?
Yeah, I mean, overwhelmingly so far from the consumer lens, it's a positive decision. And, I think for all the same reasons that you just listed in the US, affordability has become a very big problem on the EV side in particular. People hear about the quality of the Chinese product when it comes to EVs, and they want to try it. It's one of those things that it's gone on for years, and people are interested. Whether or not that will, turn into real high volume sales is tough to know. The EV market in Canada is on a percentage basis bigger than the US. It's we have a couple provinces that are very far ahead of others. British Columbia and Quebec have incentivized EVs for over a decade at this point.
Okay.
Those incentives are being dialed back. So that's another question mark on what's going to happen in terms of EV uptake. Essentially last year, most of the programs were dialed back. The federal program ran out of money entirely up here. So there's no incentive in quite a number of provinces, lower incentives in others. So that, basically walloped ZEV penetration. It was cut in half throughout the year. And it did show some signs of recovery by the end of the year. We don't have full data yet, but it is showing that, things may bounce back. But what capacity there is to buy these vehicles and what people will want them is really, we're going to see, because it's in at least a few provinces and urban centers, I would say the answer is yes, they'll enthusiastically adopt them. In others, there's some serious problems with EV adoption. You think of a province like Alberta that typically you drive long distances, it's the oil capital of Canada. Adoption's probably not going to go up that quickly.
No, I mean, Alberta is like North Dakota minus the people. And no, that makes total sense to me. I mean, and is that kind of like the United States, the West Coast, the urban centers in the West Coast and the Eastern urban centers, culturally, just in terms of the use case, right? As you say, you're not driving across 50 miles of prairie to go get a beer. That makes total sense to me. But even so, those are potentially significant markets, right? I mean, it's not like nobody lives in Vancouver. Plenty of people live in Vancouver, and I think there are markets, honestly, that the U.S. companies, Tesla and the Detroit Three, and for that matter, the European companies, I think those are all markets that they would love to sell their EVs.
And you also have
vehicles.
to take into account just how much Canadian consumers have been irked by this whole U.S. trade issue. And U.S. aggression essentially against Canada. People who used to buy an F-150 might not be quite as willing to do so anymore. And we're seeing that reflected in the numbers already. U.S. share of the market is going down, and it's unlikely to really recover, at least in the short term, that I can see. So as openness to China grows, that alignedness to the U.S. is going in the wrong direction for U.S. automakers.
Yeah. Well, it's not going to help. I was just reading today that apparently someone on the White House staff, or someone posted on Trump's social media or some social media, the map of Canada with the American flag. I mean, that kind of stuff. As you say, people respond to that sort of thing. And so, yeah, that's a challenge. That might be a challenge for Tesla. I mean,
It was last year. Tesla
is
numbers,
that right?
aside from the incentives and tariffs and whatnot, which did hit them hard, Tesla sales in Canada were down 66% last year.
Oh my goodness.
Well,
Okay.
so
And that's well outpaces the market. And there are other factors, but by no small measure was Elon Musk tweeting that Canada is not a real country. Didn't help.
Yeah,
so
not great. Go ahead.
with regards to Tesla, first and foremost, they have a product problem. It's a 5 and a 7-year-old car. Okay. Hyundai has caught up a little bit, and some of these other companies, Toyota with the PHEVs, so the Tesla and the Model 3 and the Model Y just aren't as competitive as they were 3 or 4 years ago. And that's going to be exacerbated by the fact that there are now Chinese cars going to be imported alongside the Tesla Model 3 and Model Y. And, we can say they're going to ship from Shanghai, but they have an overcapacity issue right now. And Joe and I talked about it in a previous episode. But the other thing, too, is that I see Chinese companies having almost like a 3-year window, meaning the duration of Trump's current term, in order to fill this void. Because, David, to your point, if the U.S. automakers still continue to not be resonating with Canadian consumers because of all these different reasons, that's a huge opportunity. But then I looked at the fine print on the Canadian trade deal. It's 49,000 units going up to 70 within 5 years. So it doesn't significantly grow, which incentivizes the Chinese to come sooner rather than later in order to build that foundation. Do you see opportunities for Chinese battery companies, other types of components to really enter Canada while the iron is hot? Because the landscape for Canadian automotive could change completely within the next 4 or 5 years, if so.
Yeah. I think it all depends on risk appetite, really, because that's the thing. The reality of the Canadian market is that often, particularly when it comes to automotive, if you're talking about building an assembly plant, you need to set it up with some idea of supplying the US. Canada is a pretty big market, but we're not that big. You can't supply just Canada and have an assembly plant in Canada. That's the reality that, pretty much everyone will acknowledge. And, it probably applies the same way to componentry, that it's difficult to supply just the Canadian market. Maybe if you have a few dedicated customers, you could make it work, and many do. But, it's going to be risk appetite. What company is willing to come plant a flag here with the opportunity that the Canada and the US iron things out, or the hope that the US and Canada iron things out? Because if, one or more do, it's rolling the dice on whether or not the trading relationship between Canada and the US can normalize again, but they'll have a huge head start if it does, because, there may not be the opportunity otherwise.
Yeah, no, that I mean, and you're right. You make a good point about risk appetite. I guess if I ran Magna, and it's probably a good thing for their shareholders that I don't, but if I ran Magna, I would be putting up the, give us a call message, because, they do contract manufacturing. To your point about the lack of a scalable, or an at scale volume. Well, Magna knows how to do low volume manufacturing. And I'm sure other Canadian auto suppliers who have different capabilities probably are thinking, how could we help here? But it's an interesting opportunity. I guess this may be the realm of speculation, but maybe there's some things to know. And this goes back to the point that we were talking about earlier about the sort of the U.S. hostility toward Chinese vehicles and Chinese technology. I wonder how this is going to affect the USMCA talks that are coming up, because if all of a sudden you have sort of the Trojan horse of Chinese vehicles being established or built in Canada, now what happens? As you said, I mean, does the United States say, well, yeah, we'll have open trade, or we'll have some sort of trade deal, but you can't let any of those Chinese cars in? Is there any discussion of the potential impact on the relationship heading into these USMCA talks, or is it just like, the heck with it? We just got to move on. I don't know. I'm just curious how that's
I think
playing.
it's early days.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's all going to come out. I have absolutely no doubt on that. But yeah, I mean, there's unquestionable ramifications for the USMCA here if it all goes according to plan. Because, that's why I said earlier on that I think, you have to wonder what Carney's play is here, that, maybe he thinks the USMCA is going by the wayside. Because if it weren't, then yeah, this is going to create all kinds of problems for it. But it could also just be a lever for Canada as well. Canada has plenty of leverage in these talks, but the US is a far bigger country. We rely on trade with the US more than it does with Canada. We all recognize that. So the more leverage you can build going into negotiations is probably good. And if this is one more arrow in the quiver for Carney going into those talks to make things work, to make things go back to the way they were, you can't fault him for trying. But at the same time, all his messaging, what we heard in Davos yesterday, indicates that he doesn't think we're going back.
Not anytime soon.
Let me kind of riff off of that, because you'd mentioned leverage, and kind of, it seems during his speech like, yes, there's no going back to the USMCA, and that creates complications for Canada and the United States. So we understand that. But I also believe, and I'd written about this in the newsletter, that Trump is probably going to try to bully the Chinese into investing in the United States as opposed to Canada or Mexico. And if I'm looking at this as a strategist in global diplomacy, the Chinese have us where we want them, right? We're going to be fighting over them to invest in either the U.S. or Mexico or Canada. Isn't that the weirdest thing? Number one, it is. I'll let you guys comment on that, but I also want to piggyback off of, do you think Carney will think shipping kits will be enough, or do you think full assembly needs to happen in Canada? So let's talk about this fighting over Chinese manufacturing, because that is the one thing nobody's really talked about, but it seems like that's what's actually happening now.
It pays to be the technology leader, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. And too, I think you're right. I think that's what could happen, because again, keeping up with Trump just on the auto business, forget about all the rest of it, is hard work. Because at the same time as you have Republicans here saying, no way, no how, we don't want those Chinese cars spying on us here. Here's Trump in Detroit saying, let them come. It'd be great. I'm all for it. So you're right. I think you're right that the spectacle here could be the BYD showing up and saying, who's got the best incentive, offer, who's got the lowest tax breaks, the cheapest utilities. Come on down, show us what you got. It does seem to put them in,
or who's willing to bypass or overlook certain restrictive policies.
Yeah.
To make our landing much softer.
Yeah. David, too. Sort of final thoughts here as we're kind of rounding toward,
Well, let me ask you about the kits first, David, and then we'll go to final thoughts.
Yeah, well, when it comes to kits, I think it's tough to say. Exactly what the Canadian government wants out of this is unclear. They've made it obvious that they want manufacturing, they want some technology, they want to be building things here. Whether or not, building cars out of kits would make the cut, or they want, a full assembly plant with a supply chain, is an open question. It's too hard to answer. But that said, we have the auto supply chain, and I think that certainly would be the aspiration, would be a full plant, and tons of feeder plants to support it. It would be the ideal situation. But whether or not they would settle for less, who knows?
But one thing I'm pretty certain that the Chinese automakers are allergic to are unions, which would complicate things for them entering Canada. At least in the United States, Trump could offer the southern states up as an opportunity to have non-union factories. But right, David, So Joe, let's start with you with what do you think so far? What do you think is coming up?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of it, and David, I think you're right. It's a little early to kind of know exactly how things are going to play out. I'm going to be interested. I guess we might get a little bit of a flavor for what could happen in sort of the upcoming fourth quarter reports from different Canadian, automotive companies. And it'll be interesting to see at what point, say, someone at BYD says, okay, yes, we will take advantage of this, and we are going to, I think we want to see it play out. But look, I think it's absolutely an important development, and I'm not a welcome one. I think from the point of view of the Detroit Three, including Stellantis, the more or less the incumbents. The last thing they need is more competition, and frankly, the last thing they need, and they were all very clear about it here in Detroit at our auto show. They want the USMCA to to continue. It's been good for them, and the prospect of one, that agreement being trashed, and two, the Canadian market suddenly being kind of tilted away from their brands towards, say, China. That's unwelcome all around. So yeah, I think that's where I would leave it.
And I would just add,
go ahead, David.
Oh no, just say that part of the, this is one of the results of talking about trashing that deal. I think we would never have got to this point had Trump not been sounding off over the last year about killing the USMCA. I don't think we would have been here.
And I'll echo Joe's points. This creates real risk for the U.S. automakers in a country that was very friendly to U.S. brands and is now and I'm talking every product, not just cars. Canadians are very anti-American brand on almost everything now. At least that's what I'm being told by my Canadian friends. They're not taking it personally, so they still like me. But I wouldn't be upset at them if they kind of blame me a little bit. But anyways, I digress. And it will be interesting because Carney's obviously a very, very intelligent and strategic person. I think he's going to be great for Canada, but it is linchpin. Does he feel USMCA won't get back to anywhere close to what it was? And if so, and the Chinese do come enter, and we have to think about Chery, Geely, and BYD a little bit differently because they're in the millions of units, so they could technically have a factory in Canada and the United States, to fill future demand. But for the smaller players, they would probably need to just find one place to put a factory. And so I'm maybe if anything happens drastically in the next few months, David, we'll have you back on and try to unpack it.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting time, that's for sure.
For sure. David, thanks so much for your time and for helping us sort through this too. Final thoughts before we let people go to our next until.
No, I'm hoping that we don't have to find a journalist from another country because we poked them in the eye, and now they're having trade disputes with us too. So
we need to establish relations with someone in Denmark.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh my goodness.
But David, thanks again for joining us, man, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Absolutely.
All right. Sounds great.